Welcome to Dive Publisher. What an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Shivam, for having me on your podcast today.
Look forward to this conversation with you today, sir. We'll be covering a lot of geopolitics today. I'll be understanding from you your take on different aspects of geopolitics. We understand that geopolitics as a subject is quite dynamic, especially in today's time when it keeps changing so in a fast-paced manner. So how has it changed? How has the relationship between countries changed over the years from the beginning after the World War II, then Cold War, and now? What is the change that you see?
I think geopolitics fundamentally is seen something that drives global trends, international relations, to great extent our everyday life. And that is a combination of how geography plays a role in determining the nature of politics. And we are, of course, talking here of international politics. So difference between, let's say, a landlocked state or a archipelagic state or a state with long coastline determines as to what will be its strengths and weaknesses, which also means it will to a great extent determine what will be its interest and initiatives. And therefore geopolitics is seen as a great driver of how humans have come so far and where they are going into future. Geopolitics, as you asked me, has been constantly changing itself. And something most common that has been driving this change is technology.
True.
For example, the first global empire, which is called Mongol Empire, was built on the horseback. And when people were able to discover the stirrup where you could put your feet while you're sitting on horse, and then your hands were free. And that transformed both the mobility and what you wanted to do with that mobility in that sense. And that was the source of great power which created such a large empire for Mongol people. Likewise, for example, naval fleets in more modern times of several European countries that made them colonize around the world. Or internet today, which is connecting us on real-time basis. So mobility fundamentally driven by technological innovations which are unstoppable has been constantly transforming what do we mean by geopolitics. One quick simple example would be states that were called buffer states. Then they became bridging states, and then now they're called land-linked states. So our understanding of geopolitics, our understanding of geographies constantly evolves, and therefore how that influences politics also evolves.
Right.
So sometimes I joke with my colleagues who are teaching geography that perhaps geography has become history.
That's true. So, sir, since you started our conversation with technology, you said that because of technology, the change in geopolitics is much more there and dynamic as well. And we are living in a time where artificial intelligence is going to be coming in very intensely as well. What change do you think would artificial intelligence bring in geopolitics?
There are several serious thinking people today who are trying to explain to us that artificial intelligence is perhaps comparable to nuclear revolution, which gave us superpowers, which gave us a dilemma of human quest in entire evolution of humankind being focused on greater control on power. And now nuclear revolution made us reach at such a dead end where we had more power than we can think of any use that we can put that power into. So therefore, non-use of nuclear weapon is the only use.
That's true, the deterrence.
In that sense, artificial intelligence likewise, you may have seen interviews of Yuval Noah Harari, who says for the first time, technology is not empowering but disempowering humans. So artificial intelligence is going to make humans increasingly far more dependent rather than empowered and emancipated that technologies have done so far. So yes, artificial intelligence in that sense, which is implemented through big data, Internet of Things, machine learning and so on, is going to be really an inflection point in how human civilizations have evolved over a period of time. And likewise, it is also influencing politics. For example, the way leaders communicate today, the way leaders have access to information and analysis is very different. In fact, I often tell my students in class, quantum of information that they are consuming has never happened before.
Yeah.
The things that they can find on their phone screen in a minute would have taken their grandfather 10 years to collate that kind of information, which also means what is that doing to human brain? Human brain obviously is now consuming so much more information than it has ever done before. So whether it is sociological analysis that tell us what AI is doing to us, or it is defense analysis that tell us, for example, the big debate on whether you should integrate AI to nuclear weapons. You remember, United States is very worried about it. Last year, President Biden even issued an executive order that they should not go for integration of AI with nuclear technologies, nuclear weapons. He has started a similar dialogue on the subject with the President Xi Jinping. But not all nations believe that, because there are several other nations that think AI can also be positive force. AIT can help us to increase safety, security, and keep up of our nuclear technologies. So countries like India are going for integration as much as we can, because we think AI can help us. It is for us to decide whether we want to allow AI to be disruptive or be constructive. So different debates on that subject, but there is definitely no other technology that humans have seen so far that AI is, and it has unimaginable potential in all fields, including for geopolitics.
It could go in any direction according to how we perceive it and how we take things forward. Having said that, sir, when you were speaking, I was thinking about how geopolitics is more about power play. Even though it involves trade, it involves military capabilities, it involves economics of a country, but at the grassroots reason for all these things is power play. Sir, what do you think the power play is shifting now from a unipolar to a bipolar to a multipolar world? How do you think that is happening? How will the world adapt to a multipolar world?
Politics itself is about power. Who gets when, what, where, and how, and so on. And when we talk of geopolitics, it fundamentally talks about how geography provides certain leverages or limitations in being more potent competitor in that game of politics. So when we talk of geographies shrinking, there's a whole debate on time and space shrink because of technologies. That means geographies are very differently now leveraging nations as to how to participate in that global politics. Simple example, if you go back last 7 days, we had one Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit meeting in Lima in Peru. We are talking right now as the G20 summit meeting is taking place in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And we just finished with the largest gathering ever that happens is COP29, climate summit that happens. This time it was in Baku in Azerbaijan. So world leaders are meeting so frequently in so many different destinations, dealing with so many different subjects. Now, obviously, technology is empowering them, making it possible to travel, communicate, analyze, understand, debate, and build consensus on various issues. And that is where your question about multilateralism becomes very interesting. Because there is no opportunity for any nation, howsoever powerful or weak, or no such challenge for any nation that particular nation can either harness or address, if it is a challenge, by itself. They, for everything, require now involving several other nation states to deal with any challenge. For example, the equipment that we are using for recording this interview was conceived, designed, manufactured, branded, supplied, involving several countries. So whether it is an everyday life that we live, where we are using normal artifacts and commodities, or international level decisions where you have to think of where to go in future, how to deal with big issues of climate change, issues of pandemics, issues of terrorism, issues of refugees, of migrations, that all involves increasing frequent interactions of various nations, multiple nations. And that is where summit diplomacy has become now the trend. Because national leaders in large numbers are meeting very frequently. And that is where this whole debate on multilateralism and the nature of multilateralism. For example, during Cold War that followed end of Second World War, this was largely seen as multipolarism because multipolarism was power-centric. Components and quantums of power determined as to who was the pole and who was the periphery. And multipolarism at end of Cold War gradually drifted away into multilateralism, which was more norm and law and institution driven. In between, we also tried to be more pragmatic and create something called minilateralism. Minilateralism is simply a smaller group of nations which is focusing on a particular theme which is going to be dealt over a particular limited period of time,
Right.
but invariably would have one singular nation pushing that drive in that direction,
Okay.
either from inside or from outside. Now, in fact, if you hear Indian Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar, he often talks about plurilateralism, which is the next innovative conception of where this multilateralism is possibly going. And plurilateralism is an imagination where on an overarching big theme, there will be a shared understanding which will ensure large number of countries join it, not like members, but more like partners. And within that overarching theme, there will be sub-themes, which will be like silos. And in each of these sub-themes, smaller group of nations out of the larger quantity of pool that we have, they will participate depending on their interest and ability. And that membership is again flexible. You could exit and enter any time.
Any example you want to give me for this, sir?
Several examples actually. International Solar Alliance,
Okay.
Global Coalition on Biofuels, our conferences on disaster resilient infrastructure. In fact, the world is now moving from, what was called international organizations from 17th to 20th century. We had international organizations which had a convention, constitution, secretariat, membership. Now these are groupings and networks that are much more focused on themes and how to move them forward and how to even reinterpret, change and be flexible about it. Same is membership. Now, in fact, the latest is the BRICS Plus has added several more nations as partners. As partners.
Okay, they are as partners.
They are invited to join as partners. So sometime now these groupings also bring in new members as special invitees, as dialogue partners, as observers, and now nations coming as partners. So fundamentally, capacity to be flexible and innovative, to be able to change with times, which has been the fundamental limitation of 20th century organizations like United Nations.
A quick question here. So you said these new countries such as Iran and some Central Asian countries who joined BRICS are partner countries now. They're not a proper alliance. What about the Africa Union that joined G20? Are they a partner country alliance as well?
African Union joined as a member.
Proper member.
As a proper member. And we have had also a similar multilateral organization of European Union as earlier member of G20. Let me clarify slightly in case I fail to articulate correctly. The 5 new nations that have joined BRICS, they are of course members. Originally 7 countries were being considered. Indonesia withdrew its application when this consideration was happening in last year Johannesburg summit of BRICS nations. Then, of course, 6 nations were invited. And these 6 nations included Argentina, where the government changed and the new government is not interested in taking the membership. Now, rest is 5. Out of 5, 4 members have formally joined BRICS. So, BRICS are now 9. But technically, they are 10 because Saudi Arabia is only asking for more time to study what it takes to become a member of BRICS. It's not said, I'm not becoming member. They are joining all the meetings, but they have a quasi-membership status. Now, when it comes to partners, in the last BRICS summit that took place recently in Kazan in Russia, that is where several other countries were invited now to become partner nations of BRICS nations because they have put a pause on membership at this stage. They have decided that they're not right now going to have more members, but they're free to have partners or observers or special invitees and so on, fundamentally appreciating, recognizing the need to be flexible and innovative and not be straitjacketed and rigid about who is in and who is out and what theme has to be focused in what fashion. So that I think is the trend now, and India fully understands that. That's why I gave you a few examples that Indian Prime Minister has initiated, and there are hundreds of countries that are now partners in these initiatives.
Got it. So when you speak about multilateralism, is it fair to say that UN was the first establishment that created multilateralism?
Not really. Universal Postal Union, 1874. So that is the first international organization. But international organizations have also evolved over a period of time. For example, they were conceived of originally to be nothing more than facilitators of nation states to sit and determine their agenda and outcomes. Over a period of time now, these international organizations, because as I said, world is shrinking, multilateralism is becoming more fashionable. All of us interact much more at global level than at local level, increasingly now, which makes these international organizations much more powerful in influencing the narratives, influencing how dialogues are conducted and what outcomes will come from there. So we have this new genre called international civil servants. About 1,200 international organizations exist now. Shift here is that they have increasingly become much more powerful and are able to push their own interests upon nation states. Not just facilitators of arranging tea, coffee, proper lighting and so, but now actually setting the agenda. The most apt example would be Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF, which can virtually dictate terms to nations who will receive any aid and assistance as to what are the benchmarks that they will determine. And they therefore also appear to be very rigid and inflexible, because to give you a simple example, China today is roughly about 18% of global GDP, but continues to have only 6% voting weightage in IMF. They are trying to rectify it. Western nations that are dominating, for example, World Bank president is always American citizen, IMF chief is always European, and they dominate. G7 dominates these institutions. They are saying we will rectify that kind of disjunction by what they say equiproportional increase. So if out of 10 you and me you had 8, I had 2, now you'll make my 4 and yours 16 to take it to 20. So in that sense, disjunction is still there. Chinese are very much against it because they are apparently the victims of this disjunction. So that
they're the victims, you're saying?
Because they still continue to have 6% voting weightage.
There are unions in countries which are far less, such as the African Union for that matter.
But because IMF voting weightage is determined by the GDPs.
Okay.
So like India's GDP has gone up now from about 300 billion in 1990 to nearly 4 trillion.
Yeah.
So India's voting weightage has to change. And if that doesn't change, and those dominating nations in these institutions determine that they will not budge, these countries do see themselves sometimes as victims of not being allowed. And they are trying to create parallel environment. For example, China is creating this AIIB, Asian Infrastructure and Infrastructure Investment Bank, or they have BRICS New Development Bank. So they will create their parallel organizations. From 2017, China is world's largest donor nation, not United States. For 18 years, it is the world's largest foreign trading country. So you cannot deny the change that is happening. But what I'm simply underlining when we are talking of multilateralism is that some of those 20th century international organizations, because they are rigid, they are not able to become representative of the changing times. And if these institutions are not representative of changing times, naturally then they are not going to be effective as well. United Nations, for instance, whether it is Israel's war in Gaza or it is war in Ukraine, we have seen how ineffective United Nations is appearing to be. Only countries that are having any efficacy are countries like Turkey or India, which are not operating through these international institutions, but they are operating through their own goodwill.
Bilateral connections.
Bilateral. In fact, right now as we speak, President Erdogan is presenting a proposal for freeze in Ukraine to the G20 summit right now.
Okay.
So nations are making initiatives on their own because United Nations has not been able to deliver. That is why 21st century multilateralism is transforming to make groupings and networks which are supposed to be far more flexible and innovative, so that they stay representative of the times they live in and therefore more effective.
Since you've been speaking of multilateralism, I want to put some focus on the UN. So, but we've been seeing, like you clearly mentioned as well, that UN is not being very efficient in a lot of things for a lot of reasons. That they're not relevant in today's time in all the crisis that is happening around the world. Their representation is unfair as well. There's inconsistency in their thought process, and ineffective as well. But what do you think needs to change in the system of the United Nations in order to be more effective and more catering to everyone?
I think that's a difficult question to answer. Definitely from 2004, which is 20 years now, countries have been seriously debating of reforming UN Security Council. There was a time in early 2000s when Germany, Japan, Brazil and India came
as well.
together that we need to reform UN Security Council. And it is not that UN never reformed itself. From the formation in 1945 till 61-62, United Nations membership had doubled from 50 to 110. It obviously expanded UN Security Council from 10 to 15, expanded Economic and Social Councils from 18 to 28 members, likewise many things. But it appears that now there has been enormous reluctance to think of reforming UN Security Council or UN other agencies. And that to me makes it ineffective. But problem is that there is no other alternative that we have. So until we are able to say, okay, here is an alternative which is able to provide us peace and security and development and so on. You see, there are 15 agencies and 6 organs of United Nations. Then there are International Court of Justice, Court of Arbitration, International Criminal Court, Bretton Woods institutions. These are all post Second World War creations. We don't have as of now any alternative to say, okay, let's junk these. So we can't junk these. These are still there, the only institutions that we have now. I think the recent thinking, at least in India, is that countries like India cannot keep waiting until opportunity comes and we get permanent seat with a veto in UN Security Council. So we now look at this in a much more different fashion. That I often say onus today lies on UN Security Council, not on India. India in any case is becoming far more welcome, far more acceptable around the world. Mm-hmm. So United Nations Security Council minus India is perhaps less credible.
True.
Than India outside UN Security Council. So in fact, if you look at least I for one read this in the speeches that Prime Minister and Foreign Minister make, that perhaps we have stopped being myopic as to what can India get from reforming these institutions. India now increasingly talks about how to make these institutions far more effective by making them far more representative, because focus is on global peace and development. And India's on peace and development is increasingly getting kind of more closely intertwined and entangled into how global trends are, and they will determine what India's on trends will be. Simply put, 1.4 billion people out of 8 billion, that itself is much larger part of the whole world. So if the world is able to take care of all of us, then large part of it will benefit India.
True.
Or reverse argument, if India is able to take care of its own citizens, large part of the world is already taken care of. So I think the articulations lately are how to make these existing institutions possibly far more representative and effective. How to do that, there is no easy answer as of now. And therefore, partly what is happening so far is several alternative institutions are emerging. G20 is an example, which originally was G7, G8, then BRICS nations were partly brought in as observers, then it became G20. And in G20 now we have Global South, African Union, which in that sense makes it roughly about 97 countries sitting in G20 meetings.
Absolutely.
Which makes it a parallel or mini United Nations. And if you look at the whole spectrum of issues that they are dealing with all the time, it does make something look like United Nations, because it is from women empowerment to taxing the super rich to climate change to terrorism to all kinds of issues are there on discussion. United Nations not being able to change is giving space to these, particularly I call them emerging economies. It's creating space for these countries. If they are not finding enough say in the traditional post-Second World War institutions, then there are going to be new institutions which will provide them greater say. And BRICS is another example. Today, Turkey, which is a NATO member, wants to become member of BRICS. Thailand, which is a military alliance partner of United States, along with, of course, Malaysia also, want to become part of BRICS. In fact, the latest is countries like South Korea are thinking of become part of BRICS. So obviously, large number of countries are looking at alternatives. It's not just India looking at alternatives, finding that the institutions that were created after Second World War are perhaps showing fatigue. They are looking dated. And if they are not able to change, then world has to survive and address the challenges take the opportunities through these alternative arrangements, which are largely also becoming, as I said, flexible groupings.
What a perspective on how India is making their own table, sir, that we're creating our own table by making G20 to 21 and reducing the relevance of the UN and showcasing them that they need us more than we need them at the moment. Having said that, so we'll come to India in a minute. But before that, I want to bring to your focus about how the world is so connected but divided at the same time. We are divided between the developed countries as a global north and the developing countries as the global south. What is your take on that?
I think increasing awareness of each other, the time and space shrink, that makes us know much more about each other. So we know increasingly about disparities that exist, about discriminations that exist, about disadvantages that nations have over others. But we also are becoming constantly aware of things that connect us. And that is where the whole singular exercise of G7 nations in pursuing material development, high growth rates, is being questioned now. That has produced rampant urbanization, industrialization, and lots of these crises of refugees, of terrorism, of climate, and all kinds of other challenges, of skewed development itself. Some people have all the money and lots of people have no money in that sense. So that model is being questioned increasingly, which is what is making nations rethink that we need to make our efforts, initiatives, our groupings, networks far more inclusive and far more holistic, so that it has view of as many people as possible into it, so that the outcomes that we produce are able to deliver benefits for larger number rather than just limited number of people. The old era of colonialism, where few colonial masters could, develop themselves at the cost of deindustrializing and depriving large number of colonial nations, that's no longer possible because we are all so connected and aware of each other. So any wrongdoing at one place becomes a global news instantaneously. And that is making the world far more aware. And obviously when we become far more aware of each other, I'm talking to a person who runs a podcast on social media, but media in that sense very often takes negative news as news.
True.
And therefore we perhaps become far more conscious and focused on things that are negative in terms of discriminations, in terms of disjunctions, in terms of deprivations. Whereas at the same time, if we were to look at life around the world 200 years ago or 50 years ago and life today, I think the overall picture has definitely become better, definitely in material circumstances. Now, whether spiritually, emotionally, also we have become far more relaxed, contented and happy. That is something that is questionable at this stage. I wouldn't say that only deprivations and discriminations have increased. I think empowerment has also increased around the world. And the simplest possible example would be how people are connected today around the world. States now have to work really hard to keep in know of what their citizens are doing. There is challenges of regulation of what citizens can do on their own without letting the state even be aware of. Forget asking the state to facilitate or help them to do that. So world is getting connected exponentially in that sense, becoming aware of each other. To me, that is an empowerment of, we used to hear knowledge is power. But now information definitely is freely available. Whether that is evolved into knowledge is a questionable proposition. Awareness and information is exponentially growing around the world. And that itself makes a human being far more capable of dealing with the challenges that individual has. No doubt, he or she also becomes far more aware of challenges that lie ahead of each of us, because we see how other people like us are living. And we often focus on people who are living better than us. And therefore, we think we are the ones which are denied opportunities. So that awareness, I think, is secured in the favor of negativity. Otherwise, I think just as we have become more aware of discriminations, the world overall has become more empowered and more prosperous, definitely in material terms. But as I said, ideationally, we can always still keep questioning it.
So I want to take your opinion more on the divide. I'll give you an example on that, sir, that multilateralism is nothing but multiple countries coming together for a single objective. And that's what UN does with their SDG goals as well. That's its social development goals. But is it fair to put all the countries in that social development goals bracket? Because some countries are more developed than the others, and it's difficult to put. For example, climate change.
Sure.
A few years ago, India didn't agree to the carbon emission goals that they had set at the Paris Agreement. Sure. What is your take on the favorability of countries that are already developed?
There is no doubt that some countries in Europe, I sometimes talk in terms of how mercantilism was a product of Renaissance in Christianity. And mercantilism led to Industrial Revolution, which, because civilizations like Greek civilization, Byzantine civilization, Chinese civilization, Indian civilizations, they were very rich hubs of wisdom. Even in 6th century, 4th century BC, in Takshala, Nalanda, 10,000 monks from around Eurasia used to come and study.
Yeah.
Because the roots of ancient wisdom were so empowering, overpowering. Some of these civilizations did not pursue that material pursuit which European nations were able to pursue and go through Industrial Revolution, which empowered them to colonize the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And that led to their rapid development. But today we know that rampant industrialization has created climate crisis to a great extent. Now, of course, more recently, China is the largest greenhouse gas producing country. That question is often asked. Now, what about others? These countries became developed, creating ozone layer depletion, CO2 gases for the whole planet. But they were the countries that benefited from it, not the whole world benefited from it. So there used to be a time when some of these countries used to talk about polluter pays principle, used to talk about per capita emissions. And then, of course, these nations saw that for about almost now, 2015 onwards, we're going to be 10 years now, Paris Climate Change Summit meeting. Developed nations had promised to create an annual $100 billion of climate finance, climate fund, and not just give finance, but also give technologies to ensure that developing and least developed countries are able to do that transition from fossil fuels to become net zero economies, which has not happened. These countries are still very reluctant to share technologies, never met that annual target of $100 billion of fund. So the narrative has now changed. And in 10 years, we have also noticed emerging economies coming to the forefront. So emerging economies are now increasingly saying, let's not just keep waiting for that great day when these countries will come to rescue us. We need to focus on self-help, South-South cooperation, need to also be far more innovative. For example, India's DPIs is transforming the whole narrative of technology transfer. Advanced technologies were never easy to come by. Ideally, the country that developed them will not share or will share only with friends and share with high costs. India is offering DPIs for free, anyone who wants to take it. Whether it is our platforms during the pandemic, CoWIN platform, or all the UPIs now, any nation can take it from us. And that is changing how India is willing to share its technology platforms for free. And in that sense, there are examples I mentioned earlier of International Solar Alliance, Global Coalition of Biofuels and so on, how India can create more innovative ways of transitioning from fossil fuels to net zero economy possibilities. Yes, some subconscious pangs of having not been able to punish the polluters is there, but that is increasingly not becoming the focus. Focus is becoming how each of these nations. Therefore, you have now moved from what was called CBDR, which is common but differential targets, to now INDCs, independently determined national targets. So each nation decides as to when it wants to achieve net zero in terms of its economic productivity. India has given 2070, for example. Chinese have given 2060, for example. Different nations have given their own targets. But now big debate of President Trump likely to take over. He believes in fossil fuels. He's going to increase that production. What happens to climate change debate is coming under certain, again, cloud of uncertainty. But I think increasingly more and more nations are thinking that fine, if developed industrialized nations are willing to help us, we will welcome it. But emerging economies, BRICS nations, are now trying to deviate to say, let's also look at solutions that we can build for ourselves, because this is a existential threat.
True.
And it's climate crisis. Scientists are no longer talking of capping it at 1.5 degrees Celsius for 21st century. It's not possible. It's not reversible.
Over it, yeah.
Now they are talking of 2 degrees Celsius, which is going to create enormous coastal crisis and so on. So, since the challenge is there, which is constantly making many sectors irreversible in terms of damage done. So therefore, these nations are thinking that we should perhaps focus on what we can do rather than just keep blaming others or waiting for others.
So do you think we are collectively waiting for artificial intelligence to give us a solution for climate crisis? And do you think that is possible as well? Do you think AI can solve climate change?
Every new technology that we have developed so far have helped human race to deal with the challenges that it has had. So I would not be able to deny in theory that AI can potentially give us instrumentalities of dealing with climate crisis. But as of now, I don't have any evidence of that happening through AI. That is partly also because AI is like an explosion. So we are still not in grip with what it is able to do and what it is doing actually around us. So a lot of it, just like nuclear evolution, we only focused on bomb. We never focused on million other things that nuclear technology can do. Likewise, on AI also, perhaps we are not in fully in grip. We are not even in full awareness of what potential it has.
True.
But it is definitely the most game-changing technology that we have developed so far. And it's possible, therefore, that it can, I'm trying to remember name of a great philosopher in 1940s who used to say technology can remove poverty from the face of earth, except that politics will not allow it. Because for politics, there must be people who are powerful compared to others.
True.
And they will ensure that discrimination sustains. Or we could talk of caste system and so on. So society and politics perhaps sometimes does not allow potential to be fully accessed. So, not only what AI can deliver, the point I'm trying to make, but what we think will be acceptable for our politics, for our society, to let that potential be availed for all of us. That is also a related question to
You're absolutely right, sir. The society doesn't allow everyone to be empowered in order to be powerful in terms of being knowledgeable and making the right decisions. So let's change our focus to US, China and India now. US always seek a unipolar world. They want to keep all the power to themselves. China is ready for a bipolar kind of situation where they want to share that power with US. And then there's India, who is looking for a multipolar world, who believes in more like a multipolar world. Where is this going towards now? What do you think after the elections in the US, Trump coming back in? How do you think this changes?
What makes the world bracket US, China, India together is that most projections believe that by middle of this century, somewhere in the middle of this century, China will be world's largest economy, India will be second largest economy, and United States will be third largest economy. That is what makes people bracket these nations together. Now, at this stage, we understand United States is about 27, 28 trillion economy. China is about 19 to 20 trillion economy. India is about 4 trillion economy. That is enormous gap between India and China, and also substantial gap between China and United States. United States had similar concerns in 1970s when Japan was rising as an economic power. But whatever said and done, beyond a point, Japan could not emerge as a challenge to United States. And that is the effort United States is making, that they don't want to see China emerging as a economy which is larger, or a country which has more advanced technologies or more innovative ways of life, which
And more
makes
influence as well.
more
around the world.
influence. So United States power is not simply in its economy or military. If you allow me, seduction of United States is in its innovation. So
True.
all people around the world wants to send their children to American universities or wants them to work in some of these big companies in United States. So information technology, for example, about 40+% of the companies that control global information are in United States. So in that sense, US has multiple advantages beyond just economic comparison of US, China and India, which I'm highlighting because India has some of those advantages.
Like what?
India's soft power, for example, whether in terms of our civilization, our culture, our Bollywood, our democracy, our way of engaging with the world, our Westminster system of being part of Commonwealth, or being founding member of United Nations. Many of these things make us far more acceptable to the major powers around the world. Whereas China is seen as a systemic challenge. India is not seen as a systemic challenge to United States, which makes rise of China relatively more complicated compared to India's rise. It's also possible that when India becomes 40 trillion economy, United States will have equal concerns, similar concerns about India. It's possibility. That proposition is valid. But at this stage, India's rise is much easier because we are able to access partnerships with almost everyone around the world. A typical example I often give is how India is engaged in Middle East, which is one of the turmoil-ridden areas. India is very close partner, strategic partner of Iran, also Israel, also Saudi Arabia, also UAE, also Egypt. Countries that often don't see eye to eye with each other are all friends of India. So that advantage of India is definitely a plus. So these three countries, their equations are significant.
Would you call this soft power as well? Having to,
of course,
the strategic autonomy, autonomy is also
what I call India's convening power. The way G20 was organized by India last year, the way India engages. For example, when United States wants to launch a quadrilateral security dialogue in Eastern flank for Indo-Pacific, Australia, Japan, which are alliance partners of United States, and India.
In India, yeah.
Similarly, later it wants to start a quad in the Middle East, Israel and UAE, United States and who? India. Because I just mentioned the goodwill that India has in the region. So that advantage of India is there, but important to then understand, are these three countries comfortable with each other or uncomfortable with each other? United States really sees China as a challenger. It sees China is going to diminish US leadership around the world. China's rise means US decline. India is not seen like that by United States. Now, India sees both China and United States as countries with whom it can engage. So India's foreign policy, which was for a long period of time, was built around the axis of non-alignment, has now moved to multi-alignment. Because non-alignment was far more focused on security-centric approach. Multi-alignment is focused much more on development-centric approach, which means we are trying to build as many partnerships in as many sectors with as many countries as possible. So when President Trump last time in White House suggested he wants to mediate between India and China, India said no. We can deal with our China challenge on our own.
Yeah.
India is able to deal with the United States as well as with China, and in fact with Russia also. That is a unique advantage because United States has friends, allies and adversaries. China has friends, allies and adversaries. India has adversaries, China and Pakistan, but is still able to deal with China, which is the bigger power in our neighborhood. So despite border tensions, we saw enormous trade happening between two sides, 500,000 Indians going to China every year, lot more things happening together in multilateral forums, for example. So that approach of India is going to bring India greater goodwill and influence than can be measured by simply looking at its GDP. And therefore, GDP perhaps has a limitation when you want to measure the equation of these three states. And the way India is being welcomed, approached, engaged around the world is very visible, partly thanks to very articulate foreign minister, very hyperactive prime minister, That's a good combination of political stability and so on. But these three are going to be important players, but they can never become junior partners of each other.
Right.
They can never become alliance partners of each other. They will continue to compete with each other. And whereas the competition between the United States at this stage, particularly with coming of Trump, looks far more ratcheted up, that kind of imagination in India as yet does not ignite any speculations.
Right.
So India perhaps will be able to better manage relations both with China and United States.
So you mentioned about how India is present at both Quad and BRICS, and the sentiment in Quad, US was trying to push for anti-China sentiment, and similarly in BRICS, China and the rest, Russia was trying to make it like an anti-West kind of sentiment there, and India stood their ground and said, no, this is more about economic development and technology transfer. What do you think India is doing at the moment in the geopolitical stage? Do you think that we're doing a good job?
I think India definitely brings a different kind of wisdom in international forums. United States sees China as a challenge. China does not want to focus completely on United States, but wants to create alternative arrangements that will indirectly diminish relevance of United States. India, on the other hand, is trying to do bridge building, wants to deal with United States, but also deal with China, also deal with Russia, and bridge north, south, east, west divides, going by the Vasudev Kutumbakam civilizational approach that we have. That everyone is part of the family. One of us in the family may be angry briefly, but he does not become non-member anymore. So that approach is something that is being applied by India. And that is why India is able to stay in BRICS. So when BRICS wants to become China-driven, far more anti-Western platform, wants to talk about de-dollarization and so on, India wants to be the balancer and saying, oh, we are non-Western, but we are not anti-Western. You must have heard foreign ministers saying this again and again, that BRICS is a non-Western grouping, it's not anti-Western grouping. Similarly in Quad, when you heard speeches of Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State of the presidency of Donald Trump last time, who used to say that for me, Chinese Communist Party and Chinese people are different, and I'm addressing Chinese people. Chinese were very worried about Quad becoming Asian NATO. They no longer talk about Quad becoming Asian NATO anymore. Why? Because beyond a point, in my personal assessment for one person, India stood its ground, saying that we will not like to see Quad becoming militarized or becoming exclusive club. We wanted none of the conventional military issues to be brought on agenda here. Only non-traditional security, cyber security, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, climate change, pandemics, so on. So those working groups are there in Quad. But we didn't want any conventional military issues to be brought in. So ultimately, Joe Biden in September of 2021 decided to create AUKUS, which is where military power projections are going to happen of UK, US and Australia against Chinese. So in both these, India has presented itself as a voice of stability. I sometimes also call it a voice of sanity. And that role is, I think, increasingly being appreciated by both sides. And that's why India continues to be very much integral part of both Quad and BRICS. And India is happy to see other nations joining both these groupings. So on Quad Plus, for example, South Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand are most welcome. In fact, we talk of Quad Plus Plus. Many other nations are interested in joining Quad. Similarly in BRICS, they've just added 5 more members. They've added many more now. Partner nations. So countries are getting excited to join BRICS as well in that sense. And India is the only country which sits in both these forums in that sense and has continued to be not just acceptable but also fairly influential in determining their agenda. That means India is able to do certain amount of value addition by what I said, an alternative wisdom that India brings to international forums.
Right.
And increasingly that is being recognized and appreciated.
Absolutely love to hear that we are on the rise in terms of influence, and we are doing it very diplomatically in terms of trying to get our influence. So before our conversation today, I always thought that technology is the powerful thing in geopolitics as well. Whoever runs technology runs the world. But after speaking to you, you mentioned about a demography as well, the population, the aging population. Do you want to put a little light on that, sir?
Definitely. See, technology is a result of scientific discoveries. And scientific discoveries, if they are not turned into technology, will be forgotten. When they are turned into technology, they become socially relevant. But technologies have to be then commercially massified. That means larger number of people should be able to use those technologies. And we have seen that when it comes to adopting new technologies, young people are particularly far more in aptitude. They have much greater, stronger aptitude to try new things and adopt to new technologies. So nations with younger populations are able to better achieve infusion of technology than aging populations. So yes, there is no doubt technology is a most powerful locomotive of change. But how that is adopted tells us how effective that technology is going to be.
Got it.
So if stirrups on the horseback were used only by a sportsperson, it would not have produced Mongol Empire because it was used by a warrior.
Right.
Is what led to Mongol Empire. So technology being adopted by young people gives advantage to countries that are younger. At this stage, apparently, India is a very young population. The median age is slightly above 18 years. But one has to also know it should not be young population because of circumstances like what happened in Afghanistan. Afghanistan also has a median age of 18, but that's for very different reasons. By comparison, China has 28 years of median age. United States has 38 years.
38, yeah.
So in that sense, adaptability to new technologies favors India in that sense. In fact, I generally say that young populations are restive. If they are given proper, channeled into a proper direction, they are very innovative. But even if they are not challenged, they will definitely consume more. Hopefully, they will produce more. And still, hopefully, they will innovate more. So, for example, India's rate of improvisations on IPRs that are patented is one of the best in the world. Countries like China have 10 times more patenting than India has. But at every stage in implementing that patent, every common man is constantly improvising as to maybe he can do this thing slightly differently. So that tradition of free thinking, improvising is very strong in India, and young population helps that also. Technology is not simply a gadget. See, each gadget, each one of us uses differently. So technology is available, but younger populations will do it far more productive way,
Right.
rather than just absorbing new technology for its sake. So younger populations of India will keep India on the growth trajectory. If we have political stability, wisdom of our leadership, I think we will be able to keep that growth trajectory definitely for about 2 more decades, because then we will start moving towards aging population. And then the focus will go to Africa. Africa in the second half of 21st century will be the young population continent. And some of the countries like China, India also, are increasingly aware of it and engaging many of these countries.
Already we are trying to get
Absolutely.
in resources from there.
So you see, there is an opportunity here. So when we say Viksit Bharat by 2047, it's not simply 100 years of India's independence. It's also because by that time we will move into aging population demographic. We will have to focus much more on automation of production, innovation, far more different ways of doing things, robotics and so on. That will be the only way to sustain higher growth rates. But that will ultimately give way, because nothing can compete young population. And I think therefore these 2 decades are great opportunity for India to give proper direction. And that's why you see the whole focus on smart cities, on skill building, on clean cities. We are now 4th largest on startups. We are also, I think, 100 plus unicorns and so on. In that sense, India largely is already moving in a certain direction of growth trajectory. The national leadership can facilitate that and utilize those leverages to make India's stature at the global level rise into becoming far more sort of influential
Right.
in determining global growth trajectories also.
Right. So keeping these factors in mind, if you had the power to change some policies for India at the moment to leverage the situation of a youthful population and the technology advancement, what kind of policies would you change? So
I always believe that most policies are extremely useful and extremely game changing when they are conceived of. Two things remain our challenge. One, that policies need to constantly evolve and change based on evaluations and auditing. That part of evaluating and auditing how these policies are being implemented on the ground, that is where we need to focus much more than we have done perhaps. And second, also perhaps in the overall implementation, the cobwebs, not the policy, but the cobwebs, roadblocks, hiccups that appear on the ground in implementing that, either because of advocacy not being strong enough to make people aware of what is available for them to do, what is the benefits they can draw and how they can draw that benefits. So government has hundreds and hundreds of policies. For example, Prime Minister has launched, I think, nearly 100 plus missions. Many of them are fairly successful, but many of them perhaps people are not even aware that these are benefits that are meant for them and how they can make best use of it. Sometimes there are sociological limitations of, should I be seen as weak and vulnerable because I come from a upper caste or something like that, or a good family. So those hiccups and roadblocks on the ground, whether they are sociological or political or economic or legal, they need also to be taken care of so that the policy can have smooth sailing on the ground. So for me, I don't think we need to really recast our policies. Most of these policies are really well designed and are supposed to transform this country. Implementation part, both in terms of auditing, evaluating, and constantly changing actual nitty-gritty parts of those policies, and be clearing the cobwebs that make policies on the ground not moving as seamlessly as they ideally should be. So in that sense, I think it's not just the apex level leadership, it's each of us on the ground as our common citizens. We have to begin taking pride in a country we belong. And we have to also begin to be increasing our awareness as to what is my right and what is my duty. So that collectively, I and you will have much more wholesome, successful, fulfilling life. And that is where the brick building will make the nation great. A nation great doesn't become because some great leader wants to transform a country just by his own imagination. He has to instill.
ऐसे अब सब देख रहे हैं अपना कोलगेट डेंटल रिपोर्ट, क्योंकि शुरू हुआ है कोलगेट ओरल हेल्थ मूवमेंट। क्यूआर कोड स्कैन करो, फोटोज भेजो और पाओ फ्री डेंटल रिपोर्ट चुटकी में।
कोलगेट द्वारा दंत हित में जारी।
Drive home the BMW X1 at rupees 34,999 per month and enjoy additional benefits.
That desire, that sentiment, that passion, that zeal into every common citizen. But Absolutely. It is equally responsibility of common citizens to grasp understanding of that historic opportunity that I mentioned lies in next 20 years.
Right.
When we'll still have more or less young population, we'll be still not hitting the curve of aging population, that we can transform this country, our lives, and contribute to transforming the world around us, because that will always influence how we live and how we, experience our lives.
Really well said, sir. It is important to continuously evolve and change with all the things that are happening, with not just be unidirectional, but keep evolving with the change that's happening around us. So I do realize that we're running short of time, and I've absolutely loved this conversation to another level. I would love for you to come again. But before we go today, I ask my guests two personal questions, if you allow me, sir. Sure. First is, if there was a piece of advice you would want to give to your younger self, someone in your in a shoe at the moment, 20 years, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, what advice would you give them, sir?
I think have confidence in your own convictions. Invariably, older generations often are not able to appreciate the disruptive or revolutionary ideas that younger people have. And if they have confidence in their convictions, they should persist with that. And convince older generation that what they are thinking is not misplaced. And then they want to put their life on stake to pursue those passions of theirs.
Wow. Wow. So this is quite useful for me also to understand and make better decisions and keep going at what I really believe in. So second question, since the last question today for today evening, since this podcast is called Diary of a Publisher, I make sure to ask my guests a question based on a book. If there's a book that you wish you would have read earlier in life to gain that perspective with that book that you gained, which book would that be? I know it's a difficult question because you read so much. But
Yes, I was just thinking that because I'm in a profession where I constantly keep reading books. But one book that comes to mind related to your first question is a book I read which in that sense changed my mind on several issues. And I think my comment on your last question was partly thanks to the book.
Wow.
It is by Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Anxious Generation. It's a book that came this year and I think is a book that more people should read to understand young people. I think it's in many ways revealing as to how what the book calls is the Z generation is dealing with life and their challenges. So if I have to look at a book that has relevance to your last question, because I normally read books on international relations.
Yes, sir.
But for a change, I should mention the book that is related to the question that you asked me before. I think that book made me look at younger people differently in several ways.
So is it because of the psychology? The book explains much better psychology of the youthful population.
It's a holistic analysis on how the Z generation had their childhood, which he calls did not experience playground, experienced playing on screens.
Technology.
And that generation has had very different imaginations of life and have very different priorities in life, therefore. Anxiety is something that is becoming increasingly a matter of concern for that generation. And that's why the book is called The Anxious Generation. That kind of anxiety did not appear in generations before because most of earlier generations were relatively far more in touch with actual real world around us. Compared to the Z generation being far more screen-centric generation.
True. Very true.
And that has ingrained many new things in their persona, in their psyche. And he talks about pruning of neurons in human brain in age of 13 to 15, which is where the foundations of who we are gets laid.
True. Because
neurons that are not relevant during that 2 years become virtually dysfunctional. So if in older age you think you can imagine things very differently, that's not very easy exercise. For example, we often say that learning new things in older age is much difficult.
Yeah.
Because young people have all their brain fully functional.
Neurons are connected more.
And parts of those neurons begin to become cavity, begin to die during that very influential age, teenage. That is why from teenage to adult, that's your new birth.
Right.
You have first your birth. So in first 2 years, human brain evolves enormously. And then you have this second birth from childhood to adulthood. So I found that book very interesting. I think
I'll make sure to get that on my list.
I will look like sponsoring the book.
No, but that's the idea, to suggest people good books. Wow, this has been a really brilliant conversation for me. So insightful, so inspiring. I absolutely love the conversation. There's so much I took away. And I'm sure the audience had a lot to take away as well. So I really appreciate you for your time.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, Shivam. And thank you for having me on your podcast again.
We at DOAP are working really hard to take this podcast to the next level. Our guests are going to get even better. Our production quality is going to get even better. And hopefully, I'm going to get even better too. Most importantly, we are committed to being consistent and continue to do what we love the most. Until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you.